So this is Pickleball Noise Relief Group on Facebook. We are hosting yet another Zoom call with our members and special guests. My name is Nalini Lazowitz, and I live in Southern California in a beautiful suburb called La Cañada, Flint Ridge. Les Blomberg, you are executive director of a nonprofit called Noise Pollution Clearinghouse. And thanks to you, I realized that I'm not just an environmentalist, I'm a noise activist. I never knew about that man-made pollution, and after 3 years of being involved, I've certainly learned a lot. So if I can introduce you.
Running a national nonprofit concerning noise pollution, been doing it for between 25 and 30 years.
I think of you as the guy who's read more noise ordinances than anyone in the country. Is that right?
That would be me. There's nobody else. I'm sure that nobody wants that title. So I'm sure I got it just by default.
Uh-huh.
I've written many noise ordinances and analyzed many of them. The way to think about noise regulation at the city level is that there's really two vehicles for that. One vehicle is the noise ordinance. That's usually in the city code. The other is zoning regulations, which are also in the city code. So when people say code, when people say ordinances, sometimes they use them interchangeably. And so, but there's two different kind of vehicles to regulate noise that most communities avail themselves of, and that is either your zoning regs or your noise ordinance, and ideally both.
And we've been talking about contracting with you to help draft a model noise ordinance, and this is going to be a project that we undertake over the next few months. So I really envision this as a bit of a listening session for you and for you to help us understand what some of the issues are. I know that you've looked a little bit into some of the codes that pertain to pickleball, the new ones coming online. 99% of the ordinances out there are outdated when it comes to our particular kind of noise. So if you could talk a little bit about what you're learning about what the more progressive movements have turned into at this point.
Yeah, well, the first thing I would note is that this is a problem that in an ideal world wouldn't exist, that a well-written noise ordinance in existence right now should address most of the problems you're facing. I can see there's certain unique things about pickleball that might make it necessary to have standalone provisions. And I think that's a good idea, but a standalone provision for pickleball is kind of a Band-Aid approach, where the comprehensive approach is just to have a good noise ordinance in place. And it would seem to be, and good zoning regulations in place. And so if you're having problems, it's because that doesn't exist in your communities right now. So that's the first. I mean, I would start with that as the first thing. That yeah, there's all these pickleball provisions that are useful and could be used, but a good noise ordinance would address many, if not all. I don't think all, but many of the problems, would eliminate the worst offenders that you're dealing with.
So we'll try to get into what makes a good noise ordinance in general. One guest we have here on the call is Dr. Lance Willis, who has been an advisor for a lot of communities and cities across the country on noise analysis for projects. Les, I had a question I wanted to run by you, or have you join in to discuss this one little topic, if I could. When we talk about the noise ordinances that exist, a lot of them, go into the measurement in terms of decibels. And we keep running into this problem where, as a matter of fact, I'm going to share my screen right now and show you samples. you know, a lot of these charts that are used and provided to the city planners and whatnot, the city councils, they talk about these dB levels and what is annoying, what is hazardous, you know, uh, what is typical. We see these all the time, and yet for us, it doesn't seem to match what we're hearing. And so, Lance, I wanted you to try to talk a little bit about the challenge that we face in getting the information across when we're talking to our city leaders.
Well, the biggest problem is that the city planners have no understanding of noise assessment. So it's really a process of education to begin with. And when I've helped municipalities draft noise ordinances, the first several meetings are usually just trying to educate them on how human beings actually experience sound. And it's very different from the charts that you're showing. The one that you have up now is actually better than about 95% of them because it actually has distances from the sound source on it, whereas most of them don't even have that.
And
But
then there's this whole issue of A-weighted and LMAX and that part of the noise ordinance that has to be inserted so we can understand the impulsive noise of pickleball.
right, well, when you're dealing with time variant sound, that's a whole nother dimension of complexity, uh, which is really a bit more complex than just the frequency response of human hearing, which is, you know, what you're essentially approximating with A weighting. Yeah, and so that's one of the big hurdles. There's also kind of a mindset that whatever test you put in place needs to be simple enough that a police officer could go out with a sound level meter and assess it. And that's why I think you kind of end up defaulting to things like LMAX, which are, you know, it's a shorter time weighting and shorter averaging time. But when you're dealing with something like impact sound, you know, sound that's produced by an impact process, that really is misleading because it's only a measure of loudness. It doesn't include the other factors that contribute to annoyance, like onset rate.
Well, we ran into that a week ago. There was a big hearing, a quasi-judicial hearing for Ocean Village HOA, POA in Florida, and the neighbors lost by one vote, and it had to do with the fact that the sound report for that site claimed that if you could get the decibel level to the same decibel level or below of the ambient noise, everything would be fine. But because that impulsive nature wasn't really identified as being unique, it's so hard for the city council members to say, well, no, we have to disregard this sound report. You know, we have to trust the experts.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that case, and I did recommend that they disregard a lot of the measurements that were done because they were not compliant with the requirements of the local code, which had specifications on what type of equipment needed to be used. But yeah, that goes back to what I was just saying, that when you use a metric like L max, which is a kind of a very rough approximation of how we experience the sensation of loudness for impulsive sounds that are less than about 200 milliseconds in duration. But that does not include the other factors that contribute to annoyance, particularly onset rate, when you're talking about sound produced by an impact process like a pickleball paddle.
Right, right. Well, thank you for joining us on that one. And let me see, I have to get back to gallery view here. If Trudy Shifter. Yes, hold on. You can go ahead and unmute yourself, Trudy. And then Connie can be next.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, and I want to thank Lance for doing a very professional review. I was a witness at this hearing. It was in my city. The hearing took 5 hours. And my conclusion is absolutely, and it's based on how cities make decisions, based on their laws and how they understand whether or not those laws have been broken, and what constitutes an expert. And in Florida, there's something called the Dauber decision, which allows, we were unable to throw out the other expert. That Lance very clearly in written testimony, technical testimony, refuted. But the city, these guys are commissioners, they don't have the knowledge, or since we were not able to prove that what was presented could not meet the noise ordinance. And in this case, our noise ordinance is pretty good in the sense that it includes annoyance. It includes a very specific clause that does not require a sound meter, that says if the residents are annoyed, disrupted, their peace, serenity, then that's not allowed. Yet this commission still voted to move forward with these courts because they are not in a position to choose expert A over expert B. There is no guidance to show how, based on degree, based on peer-reviewed papers, that you can throw one expert out over the other.
Right.
There's only one thing that I believe that can be put in a noise ordinance that will save us. And that's a minimum distance of whether it's 350 or 500 feet, whatever it is. Everything else is bullshit and isn't going to help us. I'm absolutely convinced.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Les?
Yeah, well, my regulatory philosophy is that you include as many regulatory tools as possible in an ordinance or a regulation. That means having a decibel level in there. That means having a setback distance in there. That means having time of day restrictions in there. That means having day of week restrictions in there. That means having plainly audible standard in there. So there's you have to equip police officers with an array of tools. And I've been reading the chats, and some people are saying we had a good ordinance, but there was no enforcement. Well, yeah, I mean that's another part of it. But and she's right that distance is one of the easiest to measure and quantify. It's an objective standard. Anybody, with probably a 6th grade education can measure, the 350 feet or whatever the setback is that's chosen. And so, I think that's a great tool that belongs in the zoning regs, that belongs in the noise ordinance. But some of the problems that Trudy notes, I mean, those types of problems, they're very specific to individual communities and to the people on the boards. I can come up with dozens of horror stories like that, where, if a board wants to decide something and, it doesn't matter, that doesn't mean that you don't want to, that it's always going to be that way, that it's going to be that way everywhere. I mean, there are going to be places where we run into that and where a lot of extra effort needs to be undertaken. But if you get a good noise ordinance with good enforcement in place, you would, cut down many of these things before they even get very far along at all. And and I think, you know, if you don't want to always be playing catch up in every community, what you need is a good community noise ordinance.
One question I have about the penalty for impulsive noise.
So you do see this in noise ordinances. There's two types of penalties or adjustments for impulsive noise that you find in noise ordinances. One is what you describe, where some noise ordinances will increase the level permitted if it's impulsive, on the assumption, I think, in those communities that that's a rare event, that's just a one-off event. I think that's absolutely the wrong way to do it for a couple of reasons. Number one is, if the noise is just a one-off event and a rare, unusual event, number one, the police are never going to capture it, and so you don't have to worry about it. And number two, you know, it's not going to generate a complaint if it's just a rare occurrence. What the literature indicates is that impulsive noise is more disturbing than a steady state noise, and that you need a penalty in the other direction, lowering the limit when you have either impulsive noise or tonal noise. Where this has been most studied is around things like gun clubs, and where there's, you know, a lot of shooting, where it's another source of impulsive noise. And they've done studies where they compare the level of disturbance in the neighbors, and you know, often with the percent highly annoyed being the metric, and they adjust the noise based on the fact that impulsive noise is more annoying. You're right, however, that those studies generally work off of an average. That doesn't mean that noise ordinances that use a not an average time, but just an L max, can't also incorporate a penalty for impulsive noise.
I feel as though the acoustic engineers need to come up with a whole new set of graphics. I was showing you some of the other charts that we always see come up, and they don't accurately make a distinguish between ambient noise and impulsive noise. So just starting with that, David, if you could help us understand what the challenge is, putting a penalty into a code.
Yeah, I think when you deal with it, I think when you're getting into this, you get into impulsive sounds and putting it in code, that may be challenging because it may be out of the reach of the understanding of enforcement. I think that's one of the things that was pointed out earlier. Enforcement matters. Part of putting things in the code, as maybe as Les was pointing out, is the redundancy, or having various options to enforce. If they don't have police with, or if they don't have health departments or police with sound level meters, those numbers still matter. And they're really important, because if you run into a situation where you need the numbers, you have them. And maybe a legal problem, it may be more money, but that's an important part of ordinances. The impulsive part, and the penalties for, let's say, nighttime noise, or a new sound that's introduced into an area, or you know, there's all these penalties that are associated, and they're in the ANSI community noise standard, and but it doesn't necessarily show up in ordinances. It's sort of how you assess environmental noise in communities and decide whether it works, whether something works or not. And you say, okay, well, this sound is only 40 decibels, but it's impulsive, and I have to put a 10 decibel penalty on it, meaning it now is up to 50. And that's all fine. That makes sense. And for the most part, that's been worked out. I don't know that, but you can only apply, I believe, one penalty at a time. So you usually do the worst penalty based on the noise. So
And I think going back to what Trudy said, the difficulty is getting these commissioners or, council members to understand what we're talking about. That's why I think graphics are important, because we have to lobby these people before the hearings, and educate them.
Right.
Um,
Well, we do noise impacts of, let's say, grain elevators or anything that somebody wants to stick somewhere, and people will, when the advocates for the grain elevator will produce a study that omits all these things, right? And then you have to come in and say, well, that's not the way it works. You're slamming and banging, and there's maximum levels, and there's all these other things that are going on. So I agree with you that something needs to be done. I don't, this may be something that's taken under advisement by acoustics folks to come up with ways to communicate it to city officials and lay people and things like that. I think that would be, it's worthy of consideration. I think that one of the issues that we are facing, though, is that that these penalties that are part of standards aren't really in the ordinances. And so how do they get used? And then who makes the judgment? And that's why, let's say, standards are used by experts to assess whether a sound is worse than measured.
Right.
Okay, so I'll leave it there, but I see your point.
Thank you so much. Wondering, Charles, did you want to make a comment about that, the penalty issue?
Yeah, I'll make a couple comments here. Charlie Leahy. I'm in a campground in Green River, Utah, so if I have any connection problems or loud train noises in the background, please forgive that. Listen, Les, I was impressed with your paper you did some years ago on ordinances, and I believe you made a reference to there being 28,000 different jurisdictions around the country, municipalities that have ordinances.
Not have ordinances, but there are that many jurisdictions.
Okay, so anyway,
they almost all have.
I guess the point I want to make is that trying to go in and amend the ordinances around the country to deal with the most popular and explosive new sport is a long road to hoe. But what I did notice in your paper is that the most prevalent noise regulation is the general nuisance standard. There's more municipalities with a general nuisance standard than there are with a decibel limit standard. I see you nodding your head. And Trudy talked about the recent hearing in Ocean Village. The expert there acknowledged that there was a general nuisance standard in the ordinance, but he said, I'm not a lawyer. So he dismissed it. And we see this repeatedly around the country. The noise experts are so focused on the capabilities, God love them, of the sound meter with the ability to measure tone and octaves and decibels that they're overlooking the very simple explanation that needs to be made about the human annoyance. Pickleball, as we know, it's an impulsive noise. It's like a pile driver. It's like a gunshot at a distance. I'm not talking about cannons. I'm talking about a gunshot at a distance, pile drivers, nailers, and things like that. And all around the country, the cities do a pretty good job with their zoning ordinance of separating incompatible uses like that. But what's happened with pickleball, it's regarded as something like tennis, and so it sneaks in. It's got 4 times as many noise events. I think what really needs to happen, and we're seeing it, the noise consultants are losing control over the situation, and the venue is changing to the courthouse, because that's where the general nuisance standard gets applied in nuisance lawsuits. What we really need to do is to get the noise consultants to be comfortable with talking about the general nuisance provision that's already there in the ordinance. Listen, it's not that hard. You can say it's a highly impulsive noise. It's like a pile driver. It's like a forging press. It's like a gunshot. We all know that you don't put those in a residential neighborhood, but it's so easy to describe this noise. Each court creates 900 popping noises per hour, 900 an hour, 15 a minute, times 60, 900 of those popping noises an hour, back and forth, ping ponging. 900 hours.
So
Can you
if
tell me any other noise that we allow in our residential neighborhoods that creates 900 noises? The other thing that we're never seeing is that the acoustic reports never include a wave file or a PNG or whatever it would be, an audio file of the actual noise. We should be playing that noise for the benefit of the decision maker, whether it's a city council, park district, HOA board, or whoever it is.
Yeah, in fact, you should be playing it the entire time the hearing is happening, so that they can experience what you do. And if you watch the movie The Quietest Year, you'll see somebody using that technique at a city council meeting in that movie, and they get, it's the board, they react very poorly to it, and this guy reacts really well to it, and their reaction.
No. So this is where I think there's also some legal advice that needs to be taken by the group about this, because to make aware cities that if they change a noise ordinance and they've just approved something, well, so now City of Fort Pierce is in a conundrum, because let's say they never do this, they never revise their noise ordinance because they don't want to go there. This is a can of worms. They really hate this. They could do that. Or the consultant comes and tells them, we recommend 350 feet distance, and they've just approved to build one that's 170. You think the city is going to approve to do that? Okay.
And I think you got to distinguish the difference between your experience and the experience in various communities throughout the country. They're not always your experience. In a place with a good noise ordinance, I don't think you'd have most of the problems that we're dealing with here.
David Wright had his hand up. If you could give us a question, and then Connie after him.
Thank you, Nalini. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, you're coming in.
Thank you. Good discussion, good comments. I'm particularly in agreement with Les and what Lance said. I'd like to just real briefly go through a couple of real quick things, because I think there's a lot of fodder here. There's a lot of opinion. First of all, I am a noise consultant. I'm a national noise consultant. I work for a firm that has 70 offices across the country, and I don't really raise my hand or my head too often. This is a very entertaining discussion, and I've been watching it very closely.
We're happy to have you.
You're very kind, Nalini. You've also been very patient with me. Thank you. First of all, noise by definition is simply whatever's unwanted. Oh boy. So what's that mean? And it's also unhealthy, but it is whatever's unwanted. Therefore, it's subjective. When it's subjective annoyance, you have a lot of opinions, and everybody's on every side all over the place, and you cannot herd those sheep. Noise is objective. And as I think Les and Lance and others might agree, there are very good standards, and it's very simple. But nobody's going to listen to the technical standards and objectives that are in fact in place and can be useful if they could be understood. And that's an if. And that's where we are. So you have an objective issue and you have a subjective issue. Annoyance cannot be I've set noise ordinances in towns, cities, and counties across the country. I've set them 25 years ago. And I set one recently in Highland Park in Chicago, where literally the existing noise ordinance actually stated, and it was old, that you couldn't walk, chew gum, and talk at the same time without violating it in Highland Park, literally. Now, we lost the case because that's absurd, but it's true. How can you honestly say that a noise ordinance won't allow you to talk? You can't. And of course, it's absurd, but there we go. Here we are. Everybody's got this idea that it's very difficult. Well, the answer is simply, it's not. It is objective and subjective. And the answer is going to end up being, it's both. The answers are going to be both. The both means you'll have a metric. It's obviously difficult to say there's one or two or three. I think there are probably two. Number two, the nuisance value is important, and that's subjective. So the answer is both. You need a decibel and you need an annoyance. When I've seen noise pursued by a very wealthy county, they went out and bought 3 meters. Well, they never used them. They didn't know how to use them. When I've seen them used in a small town, the city council said, well, I live over here and I want it to be very quiet in my back porch. So you've got a lot of range here. The simplest, most effective, very good way to adjudicate pickleball noise is really going to come down to, with all the factors considered, distance. You can't argue with distance. Everybody can set it up. There's got to be a minimum standard of care. We all know what the levels are, max or average or level or annoyance or subjective, or even wind and humidity can affect this, but you can always set distance. So when you come down to all of this diatribe of who's right and what consultant's going to be believed and what the qualifications are and how loud is it and where and so forth and who's got the best vested interest and who's going to listen and who's not going to listen, which is most people, it's really just going to come down to a good standard. And there are societies, ANSI and Acoustical Society of America, who should be leading this now because it's a big deal. And then that can easily translate to simple distance from a residential area. And that's what we should all be standing on, because if we can't do that and we can't agree, we're not going to get anywhere. Now, there's a lot of verification, but I would finally say a good noise consultant, and there are professional noise consultants. We're not talking about people that don't do it or have a meter or have a phone or just have an opinion. We're talking about people who do it for a living every day. They get up and do it 5-10 times a day for different projects, land, SLES, etc. These are people you can rely on. And here's the funniest thing in my mind that hasn't happened yet. Everybody's afraid of hiring us. Well, what's interesting about that statement is I have never asked to be hired, nor do I want to be hired by this group. I'm learning from it. I'm vested, so I don't want to, here's my shingle. I haven't advertised my shingle, nor do I intend to. There are plenty of other ones that are good like me. But why people don't hire a good, qualified, verified consultant is honestly beyond me, because the actual fee is like 1/10 of the cost of a poor abatement.
Thanks so much, David, for adding that. I wanted to make a real quick segue to a different topic that Les can maybe help me with. I wanted to share a graph with you, a chart, from my own city code. And this is where this question came up for me was land use regulations. And in this one, you're talking about different codes. So my first local pickleball noise hotspot was in a park. And the parks has these designations, clearly acceptable, normally acceptable, blah, blah, blah. Now I have a situation where they want to put pickleball in the middle of some private schools. So that's a different category and somewhat different metrics here. Can you explain to me what this is all about and how it pertains?
First of all, what you're dealing with there is not a noise ordinance. It is the general plan. That's probably the noise element of your general plan.
Right.
And that's really different from what we've been describing. It's another place that you might want to address. This is pretty specific to California. You don't find, the reference to the general plan and a noise element in the general plan in a lot of other communities. There are some. I got to tell you that the California noise regs are some of the worst in the country for enforcement abilities, because of something that got written back in the 70s and copied repeatedly all over the place. And that is a varying threshold for different times of exposure. And so it's 55, let's say, for a certain amount of time, and 65 if it's half that time, and it's at different levels for different amounts of time. What it does is it makes police enforcement of a noise ordinance almost impossible. And it's anytime a community writes a noise ordinance that isn't easily enforced, the only really solution becomes the disturbing the peace clause. And so you end up usually criminalizing it because disturbing the peace is a criminal and not a civil offense. Sometimes noise ordinances are civil, sometimes they're criminal, but then you automatically make it a crime. You automatically force it into this catch-all. And so it's really important to get the noise ordinance right, which was kind of what I think we've been saying over and over again tonight.
Yeah.
And so, but you're bringing up a whole different feature that's very unique to California, and that's the noise element. And I don't think, that's just having to do with whether it complies with the plan. I wouldn't worry about that too much. A little bit, because it does come into effect. It does have some implications and effects, especially in cases of lawsuits. But I would focus on the noise ordinance and the zoning regs.
Okay. Connie, you had a question, and then we'll be wrapping up our call.
Okay, what ends up happening, my municipality has a good noise bylaw, not to, city shall not allow somebody to disturb the harsh and disturbing noises, to eliminate our enjoyment of our home, peace, quiet of our home. Didn't matter to the mayor in the city, right? As far as a nuisance, I have a lawyer, she's trying to go nuisance. This is not a nuisance. This negatively impacts a person's physical, mental, and emotional health. Nuisance be gone, right? Because everybody is subjective. And there's a new video out on Netflix or Prime. I didn't get to see a bit of it. It's called Heal. It's amazing what these impulsive sounds do to the brain. All these sounds like sirens, all that, like fire engines, they're a flight or fight. They make you notice it. But I don't want to hear their sounds.
This is a common problem with noise problems in general, is that in many cases, the noise makers are more numerous than the victims.
Yeah.
And
I agree.
And pickleball is a perfect example of this, where you've got people from all over the community coming to play there, but you only got, a handful of people around the facility that are. And so what do you do in that situation? And that's where I keep coming back to I agree with David entirely that the best regulation would be is a distance one. Keep coming back to the question or the point that this is why you need a good noise ordinance, because while you are outnumbered as a pickleball noise receiver in your community, as a noise receiver in your community, you are not necessarily, if you can throw yourself in with everybody else, then you're not alone. Okay. And that's why I keep coming back to, yes, let's have some pickleball specific regulations, but let's also get a good noise regulation too, because that will have fewer problems, because the mayor has got the same problem as you do, in that he or she may have somebody give a party right next to them eventually. The city councilors are in the same boat. And so that if you have a good noise ordinance that covers everything, pickleball will be included. And a good noise ordinance protects everybody. And that's the foundation. I have no problem adding specific clauses for pickleball. I mean, we do this all the time in noise ordinances. There are specific noise restrictions for, amplified music. There are specific noise restrictions for lawn mowing and lawn equipment. There are specific noise restrictions for a host of noise problems. And so, yeah, you should absolutely put them into a noise ordinance. But you will be only reacting if that's what you do.
Well,
And
thank
they
you for
need
being
help.
here and sharing your story always, Connie. We're playing a song on our Facebook group page, Pickleball Noise Relief,
From
that is
Adam.
based on an article about your situation.
Thank
So
you,
you have
Adam.
been a real spokesman.
Yeah, because he read
David,
my article.
yeah.
If you
Listen,
told them.
we want to wrap up. We like to keep these to an hour.
Thank you.
Yeah. But David, someone wanted to ask what you thought the right distance was. Here we go.
Yes, thank you. I'll make it real brief. If everybody on this call and the Facebook site all decided to take a vote and in 1 hour could walk away with simply a fairly narrow range of distance, and we said, okay, here's the solution, and we all will agree, and we'll all have the same message. And it would handle both the objective and the subjective issues with a single answer. Wouldn't that be great? And that number, that answer is simply a small, simple calculation. And I'm just going to stick my neck out without doing the calculation, which is what I shouldn't do as an objective consultant. And I'm going to say roughly 300 to 500 feet, depending on certain things. There's some footnotes and qualifications. But if we, as the professional aspect of the site, Les, Lance, myself, others, said, okay, based on 70, or let's pretend 75 dB decibels A-weighted fast max, and LEQA and all our little favorite technical metrics, let's pile them up on a pile and say, it really comes down to about 300 to 500 lineal feet from the nearest residential property. We could probably ace this entire discussion. Now, that's not anything more than a broad-based answer, and I don't want somebody to say 300 to 500 feet,
Right.
but I know it's not 100. It's probably not 200. It might be 3, and it should be 5 or 6 or whatever.
I do want to ask one last question. I'm going to reserve the right to do that. As much as you were mentioning time of day and days of week play, right? What I don't understand is even those of us who understand that the pickleball noise is impulsive, how could we ever agree to a limit like 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. or 8 a.m. to 5 p.m.? I mean, if it's harmful, it's harmful.
But there's you can major on the minors and we can minor on the majors. So we have to get to some place. It's just a statistical condition where you say, gee, most people do kind of get up and get going by 8. Not my brother at 5 a.m., but he's a minority.
Not an autistic child who's at the nursery school next door.
But we have, as you know, as everybody in this call knows, and I'll conclude, as everybody here knows, there's a lot of confusion. And we have to wade through this confusion first to get to a common understanding, not technical, not rely on the subjective opinion, but we have to get to something that we can start with and all agree on and have a common message, and then raise the flag and run out there and then help protect the autistic child, of course. But that's not the majority or the norm or the minimum, what I call the minimum standard of care.
Les, I just want to invite you to have some closing words here.
Closing words, I guess I'd close with 2 thoughts. One is, I think the best indicator of a noise problem is not the decibel level of it or anything like that, even though that's the way most noise experts work. The best, in my experience, the best indicator of whether a noise problem is going to exist or does exist is the net noise across a property line. That if you and I are neighbors, we both make noise. If it's roughly equal in terms of time, in terms of loudness, we get along, we make it work out. It's not a noise problem. When do we have noise problems in this country? It's when the net noise is usually just one way. Aviation noise, highway noise, a noise from an industrial source. It's all going one way. Whatever noise you make going back really doesn't have any impact on. And so to me, if you want to know if a noise source is going to be problematic in your community, the first thing you should ask is, what is the kind of the net noise across that property line? And if it's one way, like this pickleball situation that you're describing, you know you're going to have a noise problem. That means you've got to address it well. So that'd be the first thing. The second thing is this kind of follows on what David said. I've been on a 30-year crusade to get rid of the term unwanted sound. I hope nobody on this call ever uses that as a definition of noise again. Noise is a sound that is harmful to the health or well-being of people, animals, and ecosystems. Okay, that's what noise is. That's what we got to be talking about. That includes annoyance, because we're talking about health and well-being. Okay, so it's included within it. But if noise was unwanted sound, people like David and David would be out there measuring noise with a desire meter. Okay, but they're not doing that. They don't measure noise with a desire meter. They measure noise with a. You
said a desire meter?
Yeah, because unwanted sound, you're measuring how much you desire something. Unwanted sound is actually a new definition. Well, new meaning it's about 100 years old. But it is a new definition, a modern definition of noise. It was ironically invented by engineers, and it is just the worst possible definition because it just doesn't work. Like you said, the person that loses their hearing because they went to that rock concert, they went and heard that Who concert that they wanted to go to, have noise-induced hearing loss, meaning they have noise induced by unwanted sound that they wanted to go to and listen to. No, that's not right. It just makes no sense. And so, again, I think let's change our language. Let's talk about the health impacts. Don't talk about whether you want it or not, number one. And number two, just look at that net noise. That's where you're going to have noise problems, is if the noise is flowing one way, you're going to have a noise problem. Those are the situations that we need to address as a community. And this is absolutely one of them.
And we just have to get our message out there. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this call. And we hope to see you again real soon. I'll keep the room open, but I'll stop our recording. Really appreciate everybody's time and being here.